Hapade, Tiro. Welcome to Marianas Stories. I'm Catherine Perry, and today is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day across America, and we're joined by Walt Goodridge today. Walt, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Catherine.
Nice
and
to happy be here. MLK Day.
And happy MLK Day to you too.
Well, for those of you who don't know him, Walt is a former civil engineer and frustrated employee who quit his job to basically escape the rat race, eventually move here to Saipan and pursue his passion for writing and helping others. He's the author of Turn Your Passion into Profit and 24 other books, and we're so happy that you made time for us today to chat about civil rights on this day.
Okay, thanks a lot. Even though I don't feel eminently qualified to do so, I'm willing to help out.
Well, what I like about you being our guest today is that you kind of bring a unique perspective to the topic of civil rights, being that you're also originally from Jamaica and a world traveler, so you've kind of had an opportunity to see how civil rights is applied or not in your experience.
Right, right.
For those who maybe need a little bit of a refresher on what civil rights are, they're basically the rights that guarantee our freedoms from being infringed on by government, social organizations, or other people. And if you're wondering how that applies to us, if you chose to worship this week and nobody forced you to go and nobody told you how you had to worship, or maybe you chose not to worship, that's one way we got to exercise our civil rights this week. And then if you like our show or you don't like our show and you want to comment on it publicly, that's also one of your rights. So definitely civil rights apply to everybody, not just what MLK did. Give us a little bit of an idea about your background and how it influences your perspective on civil rights.
Okay. If you recall, when you asked me to do this interview initially, I was reluctant simply because MLK Day for a lot of people represents the civil rights struggle in the United States between blacks in America and whites in a larger society. Because I wasn't born in the United States, I was born in Jamaica, an all-black country, and I came to the United States when I was younger. I'm not American. I'm still a green card holder. I didn't feel qualified to really speak on it from the perspective that I originally thought you were asking me to speak about. Because I'm not a history. History was my worst subject in school, so I'm not a history buff, and I don't really. While I'm aware of the interrelationship between people in the United States, and from an observer's point of view, from an outsider's point of view, I believe, it's not something that I've studied, so I never felt really qualified. But as someone now who's lived here most of my life, and by here I mean the United States, I've been able to see things a little bit, I think, differently than someone who was born here and who grew up here. So there are certain things that I see that are different from the way I was brought up in Jamaica, certain things about the black experience in the United States versus what it means to be black in Jamaica, that I think is interesting, that people might be curious about or be unaware of.
So what was it like growing up in Jamaica? As you said, a black community. How was that different from what you perceived when you moved to the United States as far as civil rights?
Okay, growing up in Jamaica, we have about 2 million people there. The country has always been 90% black. There's never been a time when there was a greater majority of people in Jamaica. So I grew up with my politicians being black, being Jamaican, my teachers, the scientists, even on our currency we have Paul Bogle, a national hero on our $2 bills. So the concept of and I spent my formative years there, so my self-concept, who I am, what I'm capable of, how I relate to the larger society is different, I believe, than someone who grows up in a society in which they are the quote-unquote minority. So you don't see yourself reflected as much in the media, in television. So you might tend to see yourself as somewhat separate from the larger society. So that's one difference that I noticed, when I came to the United States.
You kind of didn't have that weight from the society you grew up about feeling repressed or that your rights were infringed on. I know one of the things you've mentioned is that in your travels around the world, you've noticed that there is a particular stereotype a lot in the media about what an American is or an African American. What are your observations on that?
One of the things that I think that I've encountered is that a lot of people, based on the proliferation of U.S. media around the world, because the movies that you watch, the advertisements, all of these things are coming out of the U.S. So a lot of people in other countries are getting their perception of what black culture is, and I put that in quotes, and they're ascribing that to all of the things that are unique to black American culture. Whereas if you're black growing up in the Caribbean, if you're black growing up in Africa, if you're black growing up in South America, it's a whole different experience. And in some cases, different language, a lot of cases, different culture. So there is no such thing from this perspective as a global black experience, even though there was a television show radio show a couple of years ago called The Global Black Experience,
Really?
which, is a whole nother discussion. But there are certain things that are unique to being Caribbean, certain things that are unique to being
What
African.
are some of the things unique to being
Well,
Caribbean?
for example, in fact, also unique things about being within the Caribbean. Let's say someone growing up in Trinidad has a different perspective on life, different perspective on themselves, different culture, different food, different religious affiliation than someone growing up in Jamaica. So even within the Caribbean, a Jamaican doesn't want to be mistaken for a Haitian, or a Haitian doesn't want to be mistaken for a Trinidadian. We have our unique identities as well. But music, culture, just ways of being, self-image, a whole little differences that if we had more time I could go into. But even a Jamaican who grew up in Jamaica, speaking the Queen's English, has a different way of communicating than someone in the United States. I mean, obviously we can all understand each other, but there are certain differences in culture. In Jamaican patois, for example, we have influence from Spain, influence from Africa, so there's certain little subtleties in how
it makes sense because it's a totally different part of the world, different political structure, different culture, different everything.
So in fact, something that I mentioned to you earlier was, sorry to interrupt you,
No.
was that growing up in an island very similar to Saipan, it might actually be easier for me to relate to somebody growing up on another tropical island in the Pacific. Since I'm coming from a tropical island in the Caribbean, a lot of the same fruit trees, a lot of the same, temperature, than it would be for me to relate to somebody in the States.
Well,
even though I might be black and they might be black in the States.
So let's talk then a little bit about what you've seen in the various places you've been. So you mentioned that in Jamaica you weren't necessarily discriminated against because of your race, or you weren't basically. But are there other forms of civil rights that are maybe not as much respected in Jamaica, or do you feel like a pretty idyllic society?
I saw something on the internet, so it must be true. That,
yeah, of course.
That they were rating countries around the world in terms of freedom of speech and freedom of the press.
Okay.
And I was actually surprised because I think Jamaica, as a place that's recognized as having freedom of the press, was actually high up there. This may not answer your question.
For not having freedom of the
No,
press, or for having
freedom
Oh,
of the
okay,
press.
that's great.
Right.
Congratulations.
I forget what number we were, but it was fairly high up there.
Okay.
But in that regard, let's see what. Well, one thing I can tell you, and this is it's a stereotype associated with Jamaica a lot, but the violence that happens during election time.
Oh.
So whereas here, most elections are fairly peaceful.
Yes.
In Jamaica, people can tend to get a little really overzealous about their particular character. So that's one aspect of your right. I mean, you can vote for who you want to, but back in the day when I was growing up, you would punch put your hand in either red ink or blue ink to represent the party that you're voting for.
Well, so you had to indicate
right.
Whoa.
So you would leave the voting area and people would know
And
whether
would
you
people
are,
get harassed for that?
harassed is a very mild term.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah. So sometimes it can get a little. So the civil rights in that regard may not be as respected by the people within the population, not the government.
Yeah,
Wouldn't be
yeah,
the government,
yeah.
restricted, but.
Well, okay, so how about your experience here in the Marianas? What do you feel the state of the protection and advocacy of civil rights is here, the practice, willingness to allow people to
Right,
exercise their civil rights?
Well, it's not something I honestly feel qualified to comment on, even
In
though
your
I've
experience.
lived here. But from what I've seen,
Yeah.
this is one of the most idyllic and I mean, when you talk about melting pot, when you're in social studies class and you talk about a melting pot, here on Saipan, obviously we have Chamorros and Carolinians and Pacific Islanders and Chinese and Koreans and Filipinos and Thais and Bangladeshis and at least one Jamaican.
20, yeah. Over 20 ethnicities
Right.
in the Marianas.
And for the most part, of course, there are little dissension here and there, little things that people, comment about each other. But for the most part, you have a society here where people are living harmoniously. And that's something that I like, something I've experienced, and I feel very welcome here when I landed, a couple of years ago. And so my experience here has been very, very positive. And from the books I've written and the things that I do, you can see I love Saipan. We love Saipan.
Well, I mean, it's so. I think when you grow up in a country like America, where your freedoms are guaranteed and your rights are guaranteed, it's really hard to imagine life without those rights. And I remember I met a gentleman from Palestine, and I asked him, what values are important in your culture? And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, in my culture, respect is one of our important values. Respect for your parents, respect for your family. And then he said, for us, it's freedom. And I never would have thought of freedom as a value, but coming from his perspective, it made sense. And I imagined what my life would be like if I didn't have freedom of movement or things like that. So, what in your experience have you seen in maybe some of your other travels, other than being in the Marianas in Jamaica, related to civil rights, and how does that inform your perspective?
Well, something that just came to me as you were talking about it, there are different ways that your civil rights can be withheld or infringed upon. And some of that can come from the people around you, and some of that can come from the government itself. So in America, for example, a lot of the infringement on the civil rights of blacks is actually coming from the government. You have the Jim Crow laws, you have actual laws on the books that say you cannot do this or you cannot do that. So there's one aspect where you're living in a society that's controlled by another group, and that group has decided for their own reason, for whatever reason it is, to restrict your civil rights from, as a particular group. So there's that, and that's a very oppressive thing. That's an institutionalized thing. That's something that is one topic. Then there's the daily interaction, which comes a lot from, the way that your neighbor will treat you often is influenced by how the government has designated you as a citizen. So there's the daily interaction. There's a daily interaction, the little microaggressions that they call it among people.
Microaggressions, wow.
Like, for example, you may not realize it, but someone of an oppressed group will go on a train, and other people come on the train, but they will refuse to sit next to that person on the train. Something that you would
Have you ever noticed this have you personally ever seen this?
I've seen it, yes. I've seen it. And some of it, yeah, I've seen it. So there's the little things like that you might not even notice. So you're reading your paper on the other side of the subway car, and you don't even notice that, there's an empty seat next to that guy for whatever reason. Maybe he has a turban on, maybe he's black, maybe, for whatever reason. So there are little slights that sometimes happen on a day-to-day that you wouldn't notice, but that pile up in a person's experience on a day-to-day basis that affect how they feel about themselves within the society, and also how other people, based on how other people treat them. So I think one of the things a lot of times that, if people aren't aware of that, like for example, just the term microaggressions is something that you may not normally encounter
yeah.
unless you actually, studying that phenomenon within a society. So I forget your question. So yes, I've
some experiences you've had in other countries or things that you've witnessed,
right.
or
From my personal experience.
Yes.
All right. Someone asked me once. I've been to China. Great experience. I love. The people are very friendly. Someone asked me once if there's racism in China. In fact, what I found really sad was that I spoke to a friend of mine in the States and told him I was spending 6 months in China going around, and he said, "Wow, that's impressive. How is the racism there?" He didn't ask, "Is there racism?"
Yeah, he assumed.
He just assumed that there is, and that
is sad.
That is sad. So he's assuming that blacks are treated the same way he's used to being treated in the United States, that is a universal thing. So one of the things that I think is important is for people to realize that it's not. The unique brand of white American racism that people experience there may not exist, and often does not exist in other places. I've been to China, Singapore, Laos, Vietnam, Thailand, a lot of places, and the welcome that I get there is, I feel much more comfortable walking through back alleys in China than I would walking on Fifth Avenue in the United States. So that's one thing. So it's a different experience. The other thing I sometimes tell my friends is, of course there are always going to be people who are biased for whatever reason. They may not like you because you have long hair. They may not like you because you're American. They may not like you. But there's always, I use the 50% of the room example. You walk into a room, let's just make up a number. 50% of the people like you, 50% of the people have a bias against you. That 50% who like you, they're going to come up to you and say hi, and you're going to feel welcome.
Yeah.
The other 50% who don't like, they're going to stay away and they're just going to point and sneer and frown. Why spend your time worrying about that 50%? For example, when I go to China, I'm sure that there are people there who may object to me, one, because I'm a foreigner, two, for whatever reason. But those are not the people I'm interacting with. Those are not the people who are running up to me and saying, "Hi, can I take my picture with you?" Those are not the people who are, rubbing my skin and saying,
thumbs up.
So I don't worry about it. And that's another thing too, as you mentioned, that because I grew up in a country where I'm not conscious about how I relate to a larger population based on my skin color, it's not something that I worry about. I'm aware of it, I see it, I can recognize it, I can see it objectively, but it's not something that is on the forefront of my mind about who I am and what I'm capable of and things like that.
So let's talk about some practical ways we can ensure civil rights of others in our community are upheld in our own personal behavior.
Right.
Before we started the show, we were chatting, and then I asked you, Walt, is it more appropriate to call somebody black or African American if they are African American?
If they are African American, right.
And does it depend on what the person's personal preference is? What is the respectful way?
Right.
To communicate.
It might be based on the person's individual preference, but I'll say two things. One, referring to someone as black is not a bad word. I am black. I grew up in a black country. It's just a color. But I think because it has always been associated with negative things in the United States, that a lot of people, particularly whites, from what I've seen, are afraid of referring to someone as black for various other reasons as well, but because they actually see it as a negative or a bad thing, which is pretty telling. But me, I'm not African American, because the two words are not synonymous. Just because someone is black and living in America doesn't mean they're African American. I am Jamaican. I'm not American. I have a Jamaican citizenship, Jamaican passport, so I am black living in America, but I'm not African American. If someone calls me that, if we're in one-on-one conversation, I may correct them and tell them, no, I'm Jamaican. But I think the point that I would make is that the two are not synonymous. And a lot of people simply when they see, in fact, some people will refer to people in other countries as African Americans. So they may go to Brazil and say, "Oh, which fellow are you talking about?" "Oh, the African American fellow over there," because they've gotten conditioned to using it as a synonym for the word black, but it's not. It refers to a person of African descent living in the United States of America who is American. So if anything, I would be, African Jamaican, but because my roots are from Africa, but I'm not African American. So, but I would encourage people just to ask,
If you have to, because
Right.
a lot of times it doesn't even matter.
Right. But for me, at least for the people here on Saipan, I'd like people to know that I'm Jamaican.
Jamaican. The only Jamaican on Saipan, is that correct?
I think there may be one other person.
I think for me, the important thing is to really look at people as individuals in order not to discriminate against them, and realize that it's really unsafe and not very fair to categorize people generally, like all Rafalawash are like this or all Chamorros are like that. We know it's not true, so why would we say that about any other group? You have good eggs and you have bad eggs,
Right.
and so we should learn to love each other. Oh, you like my shirt? It says "Go Love Serve."
Excellent.
MLK, he always wanted this holiday to be a day on, right? Versus a day off, versus a day to kick back. He wanted it to be a day. Well, maybe you can explain it better than I do, but I thought it was like community service, give back.
Right. Do something, to show that you're tolerant of. I'm not paraphrasing MLK. I'm just developing my own thing. But do something to show that you're tolerant of the fact that we live in a diverse community. I'm speaking here about Saipan.
Yeah.
And that there are lots of different groups that deserve and are entitled to their civil rights, even if they may be of other cultural groups. And one of the things we talked about was the fact, sometimes people may wonder how Martin Luther King's struggle with, and Black American struggle within the mainland United States is relevant to life here in the Pacific. And I can understand how people may not see the connection, but again, because civil rights in America and racism have been conflated, a lot of people assume that because the racism is not, or the biases here are not as part of the society as it was in the mainland, that the unique struggle that Black Americans faced in these states is not relevant here. But I would suggest that because civil rights pertain to how people and allowing people to live in civil society, because that's what civil rights are about, separate from the concept of racism, that because we have Chamorros and Carolinians and Pacific Islanders and Chukis and Yapis and Thais and Bangladeshis and all different groups here, that every one of those groups is entitled to have their civil rights, their ability to live within civil society.
To be different.
And to be different and to live within civil society and practice their religion and do all sorts of things as much as any other group, and deserve to have those rights and have them not infringed upon by another group. So the concept of civil rights, not racism necessarily, but the concept of allowing groups to live in civil society harmoniously, that is a universal concept. That is something that applies to any society that's not homogenous. Well, even then too. Even then too.
Differences.
Right.
Yeah,
But in terms of societies that have such diverse groups, that it is actually probably more relevant here. The concept of civil rights may arguably be more relevant here in a true melting pot than it is in other societies.
I do think we do a good job of having such a diverse community and living together in relative harmony. It's really something that makes our islands unique, something we can be proud of.
Right.
I want to give you the final word, but before I do, I just wanted to say that it wasn't so long ago that the local people were treated as third-class citizens under the Japanese administration. So this topic is not far removed from who we are as a people. And as I said, if you're on Facebook saying what you want, posting what you want, you're exercising your civil rights. And so it's a topic that's very relevant for us today, and something that we can I encourage you to take this day to kind of think about, reflect on your own behavior, our own behavior, and see if there's any way that we can improve ourselves as individuals and a community on this Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And Walt, your final thoughts?
As I was thinking about this over the week, you know, sometimes people ask different questions. They'll ask, have you experienced racism? Or as my friend had asked, how is the racism there? Or, one of the things that I think is important is for people to ask the right questions. When they're dealing with any challenge, anything that they're looking to, ask the right questions, answer it, and take the appropriate action. So one of the best questions to ask is not simply to accept that there is bias, accept that there are infringements on civil rights, and not accept that there's racism, but ask why. Why is that happening? Why is one group looking to deny another group their civil rights? Why is one group racist and another? Because unless you understand the motivations for it, where it's coming from, you won't really be addressing the issue correctly, and you won't take the appropriate action to eliminate it if that's what you want to do. So the two ideas that I want to suggest to people is philosophers and some psychiatrists have said that there are only two causal emotions in the universe:
Fear
and love.
Okay.
So fear and love. So why would one group deny another group of their civil rights? Would it be out of love? Probably not. It's probably out of fear. So if we assume that assumption is correct, fear and love. So then what is the fear? What is the fear of one group, why they're denying the other group their civil rights? So I suggest to you that to make it really simple, think about power and profit. They are being denied civil rights. That group is denying that group civil rights because of they're fearing loss of power, or they're fearing loss of profit. And I'll end there. So if you ask yourself, why is this happening? Why is one group being oppressed by another group? And people may tell you it's complicated, it's political, but if you distill it to those two, fear or love, it has to be fear. Then from fear, what are they afraid of? What power are they afraid of losing, or what profit they're afraid of losing? And you may find yourself heading in a more accurate direction in terms of where this is coming from, what is motivating the denial of civil rights, what is motivating the denial of the existence of racism. And from there, you can start to address the issue more appropriately and effectively if you understand that what you need to do is address the fear that is motivating the behavior, as opposed to just accepting the behavior exists and trying to re-educate people as to tolerance. Mm-hmm. You have to address what it is the root issue, what mm-hmm. it is they're afraid of. So,
big challenge there.
Absolutely, but that is why today is a day on and not a day off. So at the very least, you can do some research to find out the roots of institutionalized racism as it affects civil rights in the United States, as a way of, educating yourself as to where this is coming from.
And maybe some personal reflection, if you dare, on any root in your own hearts, in our own hearts. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for your time and your perspectives today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Lovely being here.
Again, our guest has been Walt Goodridge, and we're here celebrating Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Thank you so much for joining us on Marianas Stories.
Thank you.